So I think, Melvin, if we can shift gears a little bit, considering your target users and actual technology is quite different from the other panelists. I'd love to hear what your experience has been with Go One so far, as well as the other enterprises and ventures that you're involved with. Yeah, I would love to just hear your take on how the COVID-19 pandemic has really affected your business, and what opportunities you've spotted in this time.
No, thank you very much, Krista. It's quite an interesting one that I guess being in the space that we're in terms of human capital development, regardless of the, let's say, age or target audience, I think we experienced the COVID in a similar way. Just to give, I guess, some of the audience some context. So essentially what we provided Go One is almost like a content hub. Think of us like a Netflix for corporate training, where we aggregate training, majority online training, from the best providers globally into one ecosystem. So we bring together about 100,000 odd courses and learning resources from the best people around the world, and through economies of scale have the ability to then get better pricing than one company could or individual could on its own. And our key principle is, how do we unlock positive potential through a love for learning, but focusing on professional learning? And so if we, I guess, use that particular lens to your question, Krista, I think what I quite liked was how the elements that touched on what Jay, Wambura, and even what Dylan said, that it was similar to our experience, where I think one, the importance of context. I think definitely what COVID-19, particularly people working from home, did bring to the fore was just the importance of what does it mean to learn in a context that you're familiar with. And so, for example, we actually built out a Teams application for learning, where we actually deliver our content directly via the Teams application, again trying to lower the barriers for, let's say, professional learner to be able to access training during this time, because they're interacting so much with these collaboration tools like a Teams. But I think in the same vein, I think similar to what Dylan had mentioned here, almost debunking the myth, where I think particularly more so in Africa, what we've seen is that there's almost a myth that you can't necessarily learn a professional skill that will earn you income if it doesn't have a in-person component. And I'm the biggest fan for blended learning. But what I think this time has actually shown is just the ability for online training or online delivery to be an alternative to what was typically face-to-face, even in some of the more artisan and trade type spaces. And so seeing that, even working quite closely with a company which I'm on the board of, AdCorp, where they were historically more in-person delivery company, but really transitioned quite strongly to more online delivery. And so what you're seeing now is just the importance of reskilling coming through quite strongly as well in some of our clients, trying to think through how they skill their staff. But I think also most importantly during this time is just as things have changed, they've changed for everybody. And what we're seeing in terms of the content is that a lot more content focused on, I guess, health and well-being, particularly mental health. I think it's quite encouraging to see that also like companies are investing in that for their staff over and above, are you more productive using Excel or whatever it may be. And so definitely seeing changes across both the context, the content, but importantly, the delivery of training.
Yeah, agree completely, Melvin. Thanks for that. And I think, so while we have you, because you're sort of a bit of an outlier in terms of education stage that you're focusing on in this panel, I would love to just hear a little bit more. I know a lot of the audience members today are going to be interested in sort of understanding the business models that work or don't in Africa, right? So corporate training has been as the low-hanging fruit in terms of revenue models in edtech that actually can work and be profitable. So Melvin, I would just love to hear a little bit more as to like how the experience of growing Go One has been on the African continent. If it's been a difficult thing to do and working with corporates and having them see the value proposition that you're offering, and what other edtech offerings that maybe aren't necessarily working with corporate training specifically could learn from your experience.
Yeah, and I think it's a very valuable point. And I think when you think about the African context, I think with any geography for that matter, it's about the cultural context. And I think this is where there are some similarities, probably Southeast Asia, particularly in terms of just the important placed on qualifications and certified training. I think just the ability to, for example, have a certificate. I think the work we do in Nigeria, for example, just the interest in the market, both from the almost individual learner, but also from, let's say, a company, just trying to reinforce something that can be accredited, not necessarily by any sort of leading university, but just some attestation that someone's done the course and has a particular skill, is quite popular. And I think it's through that lens where one understands the kind of business models that I think typically work in the African context. And I think it's important to be able to link whatever you're doing and almost have a thread. So for example, I am learning in order to do something. And so being able to link, let's say in our space, linking your learning to a career path or to a particular job is so important. I think that context in learning, and I think the same thing goes for even like the K-12 space, where the context in which one learns is so important and what is the actual objective. And I think if you're able to focus on that, both in the corporate setting. So let's say individual wants to get a job, a company typically will use training for three things. So one is to obviously right to work compliance type stuff. Two is to have a more productive workforce. But three, and most increasingly, is about attracting and retaining staff. And what we find in studies is that 35% of staff actually churn due to a lack of training. And so I think if one is thinking through the market through that lens, it's important to almost focus on which one of those three pockets do you want to focus on and add value. For us, for example, on the Go On side of things, when we started out, we focused on the compliance training because we realized it wasn't necessarily a nice to have and every company needed it. But what we're seeing typically now with our companies is that in our clients that we work with across the continent, even globally for that matter, and we work with a number of companies in Southeast Asia, is they come for the compliance, but they stay for everything else. And I think it's important to not necessarily make learning a tick box exercise, but more so how do you make it more fun and interactive? And I think that's where differentiators come in. And I think the same thing would apply to any sort of education in that sector. It's about saying, can you make learning and training relevant to something of value to an individual? And in our space, that typically comes down to employment opportunities and jobs.
Thanks, Melvin. And Jay, so you're sitting sort of on the other side of the table in some of these conversations, being able to make procurement decisions for Curo. So tell me a little bit about what you look for in edtech solutions that are introduced to Curo and how you decide which ones are implementable across your schools, and how actually Curo is deciding who they should be sending resources to in terms of which solutions will work best.
Fantastic, yeah. So I think so I'm leading a space in particular called DigiEd, where we really look at how do we reduce the cost of, reduce the fees as much as possible by just working with the different levers that we have. And one of the main things we do is we see how do we replace the time that a teacher uses in the classroom with EdTech solutions. And so hence we're always looking for solutions that that are smartly designed and can really assist in lowering our costs that way, essentially, and at the same time give the educational outcomes that we want. So there are a couple of things that we do. Firstly, I mean, the first is we check whether the solution being presented has actually been independently vetted. So not where you have a board member from a university and that's the person that's vetting your solution, but rather it's a case where it's properly independently vetted. And if not, then we will actually embark on that exercise ourselves, and we'll do like a 6-month to a year-long study to see whether the solution that is being offered actually does give the kind of, does assist in learning or not. The second thing, the second part from there is actually looking at just IT compatibility and how the infrastructure is set up. The interesting thing is, I mean, because Curo, we're a huge network, we have like over 50,000 learners. So when our unit decides on a solution, it actually gets rolled out to the whole Curo network. So we're like this little incubation hub, like a startup bunch that's out there trying out all these new technologies, and then it actually gets implemented across the board and across all our schools and so forth, and then actually gets adopted quite often by the larger private school market in South Africa, because the word gets around. And but the thing is that when you want to actually provide a solution at scale, you got to think about the way you do things. Just simple things, like from an administrative perspective, do you have single sign-on capabilities? Do you have an API to actually share the data with any other platform where you could do some sort of analytics with a couple of other solutions pulled in together? The other thing in the South African context is, can you host it locally? Will the solution be hosted in Singapore? And in which case, the number of times our internet cables, undersea cables fail between South Africa and the rest of the world is just countless. So it just means like we need to see, can we actually host it locally? And even more so, like whether you can actually host it on a school server level, where you wouldn't actually, like we've actually found, even if we have a school in one of the most affluent suburbs and have 3 fiber cable lines coming into our school for redundancy purposes and so forth, we still find there are internet connectivity issues. And then the kids will actually miss out on learning on that platform for like a solid week or two. And so those are the challenges we face. And so we look for solutions where we can completely offline it at the school premises itself. In the larger South African sense, I mean, like with also our experience with COVID, we found solutions where the students can actually download an app onto their phone, but then actually the app would have to be quite heavy in terms of design, where majority of the work is done on the app rather than actually having to sync with a cloud server. So those are the kind of things we need to do, so that the data connectivity requirements are less. So we look at that. So the second is the IT part, and then of course the third is the cost factor. And you need to look at a business case where if you are providing a solution, and like our cheapest schools are about $100 a month in terms of school fees, $100 a month, and if you come along with a solution where it's a per user license and it's going to cost you $10 per user, it just won't work for us, and that's 10% of our revenue just gone straight to. Yes, and there have been solution providers have come to us with exactly that. I mean, it's so we really look for. We're saying we can provide the scale, but you need to come up with very cheap, cost-effective solutions. And if you can make it work with us, I'm pretty sure it can actually work across the board in the South African market as well, because most folks will probably want to pay like between $1 and $5 a month. For any kind of solution.
Yeah. Okay, great. And Mabora and Dylan, I think you can both probably speak to sort of the partnership model. You know, you're working with end users who are beneficiaries who aren't directly paying for your solutions, right? And you're not necessarily in every case charging a corporate per user either. So, you know, maybe speak to us a little bit about the importance of partnerships, whether it's telcos or broadcast network, or whatever kinds of partnerships you rely most heavily on, and you know, just any advice that you have for any edtech entrepreneurs that are looking to expand into the African market, and you know, would need to go about a similar route to scale. Mabora or Dylan, whoever would like to start with that one.
I could speak to the fact. So our product is actually B2C, so it's paid for by the end user, and I think that what I've learned, and not just at Eneza, but working in the tech sector and trying to price products, is that you need to be flexible and responsive to the context, and lower the amount of friction there is between the end user paying and you collect the money as much as possible. And by flexibility, I mean, for example, that I think when mobile phones themselves first came into Africa, in the West, they came with the same payment plans as they were in the West, right? A contract over a year. But today, and very soon, for companies that needed to expand and to grow the number of users, it became clear in most of sub-Saharan Africa that we needed another solution, and it moved to prepaid mobile phone plans, where you could actually buy access on a card for as little as 10 US cents and use it in a small, for as long as it works, and then you can go and buy the next one. And this, I think, are innovations that respond to some of the more uncertain circumstances that our core users, especially at Eneza, live with. For example, the market woman, the trader, the farmer. And so that's what we try to do, sort of think about which is the most frictionless way to collect from our customer and to collect in a way that responds to their the way that they receive their own income, which is quite irregular, actually, and could happen either daily or weekly or monthly, depending on the customer. And I think that's the advice I'd give to anybody here, that you need to sort of get into the circumstance knowing that you're probably going to have to respond in a different way than you are used to in Singapore, but that there are still ways for people to pay for the product and willingness to pay for the product if it is a good product for the end user. So we charge, we collect on a daily basis 3 US cents a day, and we use airtime because it's the most frictionless way to receive payment from our customers, and it works very well for us. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Nobora. Dylan, do you want to hop on that same question?
Yeah, I think in our experience, the African market is quite complicated, and we definitely have to rely on partnerships to be able to achieve a lot of what we try to do. I mean, we've got the beneficiary, definitely, as you said, doesn't pay. In many cases, we've got the middleman, which is the Department of Education, who has a whole bunch of frameworks and rules and requirements. And then you have moms and dads and the bigger community and teachers, and they all actually have different requirements, expectations, and levels of willingness to fund, pay, and or participate in the actual cost of the product. And what we found is that, I know that in your guidance notes, you asked us why we had 2 apps. And if I'm 100% transparent and honest, we had a NGO, completely corporate funded app, which has the majority of all of our videos on. And in about 2017, we decided to, in partnership with Kagiso Capital, to build a more commercial app, which would be a lot more slick. We have a development team in Amsterdam and in India that work on it. And when we actually put it into the market, and we did lots of research around it, so the content is different. It's 6 minutes long, it's short, it's animated, so that we can take it into many different territories with different localization in terms of language. And so we really well thought it out, but we found ourselves in a bit of a predicament, because actually the end user was unable to pay. So we actually are now on a whole new journey where we're taking the two and sort of colliding them together, and basically using our great, strong, well thought out structure to chop up and put in our old content as well, and move forward with some sort of quasi-mode or hybrid version. Because realistically, a monthly subscription model hasn't worked for us. And I think that's one of the realities of Africa, is that you've got to be quite careful. There's not, exactly like you were saying, the Western rules don't always apply.
Yeah, and I think a big theme that's come out of everyone's insights now is just the importance of localization, right? And especially for this audience, being Singaporean entrepreneurs, like thinking about, the context of the African continent, which of course is extremely diverse and complex, and each country, each community is very different and will have different challenges and opportunities. But I think on a whole, do any of the panelists have some sort of words of advice when thinking about localizations and adapting content perhaps, or actually adapting a product or strategy for the African market when speaking about sub-Saharan Africa specifically? If anyone would like to jump in on that one, that'd be great.
To share some initial thoughts, Krista, and just share, I guess, experience as well, even as we expanded to other countries in Africa. I think an important point was mentioned that, we can speak to Africa, but each country is unique. And I think it's important to not forget those nuances, particularly in one's go-to-market. I think for us, what was quite important was to understand what is our core competency, what is our superpower that we do better than anybody else, and how do we apply that in the local context. And so to the point, often, I think Dylan mentioned the point as well, the importance of local partners. And so it's about being able to come to an ecosystem and understand and almost map out who are the key partners you need to play well with, as it were, to be able to succeed. And for us, it was very important to say, look, we as Go One, yes, we have a global library, but when we wanted to, for example, enter, let's say, Uganda, the reality is that their regulation around, let's say, anti-money laundering will be different to that of Singapore. And so therefore it's saying, yes, we may bring leadership training, but what is unique to the market and what's most important. And I think it's important also to have that almost frank analysis, because you want to make sure you're investing where you get the greatest return. And I think often many companies don't necessarily spend the time engaging with local customers before they actually begin building their product for that market, as it were. So that would be the one thing. Stay close to your customers and also partner as you go along that journey.
Yeah, great advice, Melvin. Mbora, did you have anything to add? I saw you nodding.
Just nodding because we decided to take a difficult path. When we first created content in Kenya, we digitized the entire curriculum from grade 4 through to the end of high school. So it was easy to sort of migrate with it to Ghana, say, or Cote d'Ivoire. But what we decided, Ghana at least, because it's English. But what we decided to do instead was to say, okay, so the curriculum is different, the customer is different, even if it takes more time and maybe more resources, it makes more sense to go ground up. And so to transfer not the content, but to transfer the methodology, right? To figure out, to put in a box, what does it mean? How can we most effectively and most efficiently create content for Ghana that is similar to the one in Kenya, but built in Ghana with Ghanaian teachers and with the cooperation of the Ghana, Ghana authorities, Ghana Ministry of Education, and same thing in Cote d'Ivoire. So everywhere we go in, we sort of start by getting the local curriculum as it is detailed or provided by the Ministry of Education. And then we take this methodology, which we have tried to build up, and we're still polishing, of course, and then start from the ground up and build the content. It's been very helpful because in terms of driving usage and acceptance, it's been great for us because we're not going there as somebody who knows better, but working with the people in the local country to build a platform that works for them. Yeah.
And Dylan, have you had a similar experience in working with departments of education in the various markets that you're operating?
Yeah, and we didn't have to go very far to learn a very, very, very expensive lesson, is that when we talk about localization and customization in language, it's not a simple case of dubbing. You've got to be very, very clear that a children's story for grade 4 in English cannot just be translated into Zulu. It's not the same. It doesn't have the same efficacy in terms of scaffolding, in terms of pedagogy, in terms of right down to the basic phonics. You've got to actually, when you talk about adjusting content for a location, you aren't just dubbing it or translating it. You actually have to figure out what are you trying to teach and what is the local custom and what is the local approach, and make sure that you customize. And you do that not by adjusting, but by hiring local people that are embedded in the community. Otherwise, you will fail. I know that sounds kind of prescriptive, but it's the honest truth. 10 years of experience. If you do not engage with the locals on the ground, it won't work. And that's our experience.
Yeah, I mean, that echoes what we see at Ingenie. You know, we receive hundreds of applications from EdTech entrepreneurs every year who are wanting to participate in our program and grow their solutions. And I think, you know, we often have foreign founders who are applying to the program where, you know, everyone's based in Silicon Valley and they're expecting to launch an app in Nigeria. And, you know, they have no local context, no on the ground knowledge, and, you know, no Africans on the team, frankly. And so, I mean, that's a big red flag for us, as you're saying, Dylan. I think, you know, anyone who is interested in expanding onto the continent would need to think closely about how they grow their team in accordance with that. I know for Ingenie, you know, if you don't have a senior executive member of your team who's African and based on the continent, we probably are going to be unable to support you. So it's, I think, something to seriously consider. And Jay, I'm not sure if you have anything to add in terms of what you've seen and the kind of solutions that have approached Kiro.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think simple things is, for instance, we were just want to give you an example where we were looking at a math solution that actually came out of the UK, and you know, they said that they had already mapped it to the South African curriculum and so forth. But interestingly, every example had pounds and so forth, and then in terms of currency examples, they were talking about the London Tube. They were talking about just things are completely out of context for the South African scenario. The second part is also the, like Dylan rightly said, also like you just can't dub, and you just can't, get a voiceover artist and just copy over something. It's just there's so many customs and so forth that you have to be aware of. But also just another thing is just simple things that some folks actually forget to do that as well. So they, nothing worse than actually having a very strong accent from another part of the world. And the children really struggle to first understand what you're trying to say, overcome the accent differences, and only then can actually get onto the content that is being taught. So putting in that kind of effort is really important. In the South African context, just to give it, and this is just one country out of all the African countries where there's so many differences. We've got a host of racial groups, a host of language groups within the racial groups as well, and each variation has a different accent, has different lingo. It is just the sheer variety and diversity that's there has to be accounted for in some way. And so and when we do come up with any solution for it to actually get the kind of mass adoption that one would always hope to get, you have to really think about how you're going to approach all of that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, beyond the localization of content and consideration of the realities of the continent, I think there's also space for a conversation about the types of technologies that are appropriate. And we sort of touched on this earlier in the conversation, but, I'd be interested to hear, Melvin, you have a lot of expertise in the sort of 4IR technologies, emerging technologies. Have you seen use cases where, AI, machine learning, AR, VR, all of these things are actually, properly implemented in the African context? And, in what kind of situation can a foreign founder consider bringing some of those technologies into their solution and then scaling it on the continent?
Interesting one. I'd say for a number of years, there definitely was an instance where one used to question whether they were merely buzzwords. Think about augmented reality, virtual reality, even like a mixed reality. And typically the use cases were very esoteric. And so, for example, if you were a mining company, you didn't want to have to, let's say, for example, send your drill shaft operator down into the mine. The reality is you could then do a VR immersive experience. And the question was then, was the cost effectiveness one that actually made sense over and above the immersive learning experience? Whereas what you're seeing is augmented reality, let's say, for example, when it comes down to onboarding with an office space, just having the ability to, for example, say look, take out your phone and navigate to the office and see, oh, that's a printer, this is how you use it. So it was almost more like to the elite few. What we are seeing a lot of now, though, is because almost, organizations want to also differentiate in terms of learning experiences. And so a lot more, at least in the corporate setting, clients are asking for, how can we have a superlative learning experience over and above a video or a SCORM file or something of that nature. And so seeing a lot more interest in it in that particular way. But again, I think it's going to come down to what is the effective return in that particular way. But I think definitely we are seeing more interest in interactive training. And I think, like the thing about things like solar panels, even just general digital within education, definitely the costs are coming down. And so therefore there'll be a point at which you'll see that tip where, for example, all someone needs to do is take a cardboard box, put their phone inside their headset, and they're already in an immersive environment, as opposed to buying a HoloLens as an example. And so definitely seeing some strong movements in that space as well.
Okay, thanks, Melvin. And I don't want to miss out on these questions that are coming through in the chat. There was one specifically about the education divide, or the digital divide, I should say, between low fee schools in schools. So this was added to the chat box when Jay was busy speaking at the beginning. So this person says that they're interested in finding out how Curo plugs the gaps in learning, since learning seems to be more self-directed and bite-sized via WhatsApp and other platforms. But I think all of you can actually speak to how you're presenting a sort of cohesive learning experience through your respective solutions, while still engaging learners and keeping them entertained at the same time. It's a big ask, but if anyone has some comments on that, I'd be keen to hear.
Yeah, like maybe I could just share. Like I think one of the things is with our low fee schools, one of the deliberate strategies that we took was that the kids, our learners actually embrace self-directed learning from the day that they join. So just a good example is the first maths class that we give, especially in grade 8. One of the topics that they're supposed to learn is how to calculate the circumference of a circle and the area of a circle. So just use your general 2 pi r formula or pi r squared. And so we give them this task, and then we tell them, and then go and do it. And here are a couple of items that you got to measure, and say here's your circumference, etc. And the kids start crying, and they just start shouting. Well, not shouting, but they put their hand. They get all furious. They're like, you haven't thought test this, and so forth. And then we just tell them, well, what do you do when you're kind of lost and you need to figure out something on your own? They're just like, well, we Google it. And so then from day one, we actually just teach them, just Google it and try and find your answer. And so actually what we've really done, especially in our low fee schools, is embraced a self-directed learning type model. We use a flipped classroom methodology. And by doing that, we actually, funny enough, our kids were so well prepared for the COVID lockdown period and so forth. And when it came to giving them lessons and so on via WhatsApp, we found that they were actually able to cope very easily. So it's really a case where, from a school's perspective, you've got to first get that culture going of self-directed learning, and only then you can push out all these other solutions quite easily. So from our side, we find high engagement of our kids get home. Our schools are from 8 to 5. Kids get home, and we see actually quite a bit of activity between 6 and 8 in the evening in a lot of the platforms that we give them access to, where it's actually really up to them if they want to participate or not. So quite surprisingly, we find quite a bit of, maybe unsurprisingly, we find they're pretty engaged that way. But you've got to get them into that culture. Otherwise, like what Krista, you were saying, you've got to make the content super engaging, a lot of fun. You've got to add gamification and everything else, otherwise to actually make it stick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so Wambora, if we move over to your platform, so Aneza, as you've mentioned, utilizes SMS technology, which typically, would mean that you have to deliver content in bite-sized chunks, right? The content is concise and streamlined. So how are you managing to, ensure the best possible educational outcomes while also keeping the content as sort of limited as the technology restricts it to be?
Okay, so first of all, I like to say that we know our limitations, so we don't try to do everything, right? We want to ensure that kids are revising and interacting with content. What we do is in our text-based product, we have a very clear rhythm of three texts with the key module content, and then we have 5 questions right after that. And then built into this also is scaffolding. So the learner is moving from the simplest concept to the tougher ones. Other than that, all we do is just ensure that we delivering the content, and we also have a function in our platform which I didn't talk about, which is we allow learners to send in questions to our platform. We distribute those to teachers, and then they get a response within 5 minutes. So the combination of all this is our way of trying to sort of engineer some learning with the end user. Ask a Teacher is this platform I'm talking about, and I think it's actually been a very good way for learners to continue to have some contact with a teacher outside of school.
Yeah, and that goes back to what Melvin and others have said about the blended learning model, right? You need both. You need EdTech to be supplemented by in-person engagement and other forms of communication when that's not possible, like it is, during these lockdown times. Yeah, and so maybe Dylan, we can go over to you. what are your thoughts about sort of, the top 3 future trends or future needs in terms of what we can expect in EdTech here in the African context, or, what these foreign founders might do good to sort of jump on now?
Given the year that 2020's been, I'm quite anxious to propose something that might just get shot out of the water. What we're focusing on is, it's all about dosage for us. So we've gone historically from 2003 to now. We used to have 1 hour long lessons. We're now down to 5 minutes. The way we dish up those lessons is changing. So we're about to launch a WhatsApp chatbot that goes through our entire archive, finds what you're looking for and tries to structure it in a way. If you want a whole lesson, you can. If you are stuck on a device that's got low memory or bad data, you can choose just the bit that you want. So for us, it's about dosage. It's about getting the exact amount that's good for you right now. So it's about making sure that, and I think it's not just about technology, it's also about Generation Z. They're a very different learner. They're not able to sit down for an hour long, and there's a lot of stimuli that's required. So for us, it's about keeping that engagement and making sure that dosage is good. And it's also about being immediate. So we've gone from, we used to take questions on Facebook. We also have a similar service where you can text in a question or WhatsApp or Facebook a question. We used to take 24 hours. We now, much like Enzo, we actually have to reply almost immediately, otherwise you get thrown away. And so immediacy for us is kind of important. You've got to be relevant and you've got to be able to react quickly, otherwise you find yourself irrelevant. And I think also what's interesting, and I think it's partially as we made our migration from high school, we've now launched a primary school channel. A lot of our focus in primary school has not actually been on the core subjects. We're now moving quite carefully into wellness and well-being and a general sense of all the soft skills, all the nice things. And I think that specifically during the COVID crisis, we've realized that actually there's a definite need for that. And in African contexts, moms and dads work long, hard hours all day. And if we're able to provide, and this is where we're going, modules that are not just core learning, but also the soft and fuzzy, the sort of, I hate to say sesame because I consider them competitive, but the sort of sesame feeling, then that's sort of where we're going. And we think there's going to be a big trend towards that in terms of sort of softer, happier, looking after yourself in not just nutrition or traditional health, but mental health, and also being a well-rounded person. I think there's going to be a big move towards that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Dylan. I think there's some good insights there. So I mean, the idea of sort of personalized learning has come up a few times. Whether we use that term or another, adaptive learning is sort of the tech version of that, right? So that seems to be really important. Making sure that we're actually catering our solutions and content for the user. I mean, that sort of sounds pretty obvious, but I think a lot of solutions aren't actually doing that. They're thinking about in case thinking about what the businesses are wanting to track, what the foundations are looking for, and not necessarily how the user will respond. So I think that's also a key insight that's come out of a lot of your discussion. So I mean, I think if we just go back to the questions that are coming through, there are some questions about e-learning opportunities for preschoolers, for sort of early childhood development. I'm not sure who of you, I think, some of the mindset networks would be sort of catered to that. Mambura, Jay, I'm not sure who has some ECD experience who'd like to speak to this one.
I can add that our early childhood, our ECD and our grade R is actually our most watched product. So, and increasingly as we added Zulu, Afrikaans, etc., the numbers went up. So English is actually now the least popular grade R intervention that we have. And so there is definitely a market for that. And I think that it's a key market. Yeah, there is that. A lot of ECD from a content perspective, from a television perspective, is brought in from overseas, which means it's traditionally is in English and traditionally Americanized English. And so since there's something that is localized or slightly different from that, there are eyeballs. There is huge potential there, I think.
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. And does anyone else want to add on that? Jay, I know Kiro has some preschool activities, right?
Yes, yeah. So I think in the preschool space, definitely from the schools themselves, we are trying to embrace a lot more of e-learning solutions. I think a lot of some of the high-end schools, we're looking at actually all the kids start playing with iPads in school. Osmo is I'm sure all of you might, some of you may have heard of Osmo. It's a interactive iPad based game slash learning solution. So solutions like that, and then there are also a number of other apps that we've looked into, like Lingo Kids or Tiny Tap and Speech Blubs. So there are all these really cool solutions out there for preschoolers, and they're definitely gaining momentum. I mean, like a lot of parents are also starting to make sure that their kids play on those apps at home and so forth. But again, like what Dylan was saying, the big issue with adoption is the fact that a lot of those solutions are American solutions or Western solutions where the kids just don't understand the accents and so forth very well. So if those very same solutions had a Zulu or a Xhosa type based solution, then I think that would actually gain a lot more traction in the preschool space. That's what we've seen. So we do think there's a huge opportunity there. But again, I think you need to try and see how you can localize it.
Okay, great.
Just the other thing, just the context in this app again is with preschool and so forth. There's one set of challenges that you're encountering. The second is, like, let's say what we're finding is, let's say you design a solution for high school. Let's say it's an English or a math solution for high school in the South African context. A number of our kids actually are far behind in terms of like levels in comparison to international benchmarks. So one of the issues we're finding is that even our kids in high school, some of them are joining us in say grade 9, grade 10, their actual reading and comprehension level, English reading and comprehension level would be, say, at a grade 5. So then you're trying to offer, you're trying to give them a solution to work with, like an online solution to work with. But actually that online solution is really designed for little kids who are, in primary school. So what we really need to think about is, let's say, like the Lexile level, the average Lexile levels, the other math skills and so forth, what level the population is at an average, and then you've got to design your solutions around that as well.
Mbora, you wanted to add something?
I just thought maybe to surface Ubongo, which is a company, an education company out of Tanzania. They're doing some very good, I think, edutainment content for the ECD and lower primary. It's localized. It was digital for a long time, but now they've actually managed to put it on television as well. It's literacy and numeracy, and it's very engaging and very local. I think that's something that people can look up and see what's happening in that space for that age group.
No, it's a great solution. Okay, and Melvin, if I can go over to you, there's another question in the Q&A here that's specifically about the sort of upcoming content or courses that are needed in Africa. So this person is using coding as an example, of sort of up and coming trends and content that's sort of beginning to get some traction here. Do you have any comments or any thoughts that you'd like to share about, training Africans for sort of the digital future and making sure that the skills development are in line with the future career needs of the global sort of workforce, but specifically in the African context?
I think you definitely hit the nail on the head. What we're seeing now is that And I think it's the same across the world, if I'm honest. Everyone wants to be part of a global workforce where the skills that they have are relevant in respect to the geography they find themselves in, because they believe that obviously the porous nature of opportunities allows them to work in different contexts. I think what's interesting though, in terms of, the content needs, let's say, for example, you want to become a full stack engineer. The reality is, if you don't have a basic understanding of how to use a computer, access the internet, let's say create an email account, you'll never get to that particular point in time, because all the tools you need will require you to not use the internet, have an email login, and do certain things. And so I think what we're seeing now into the future needs is, yes, the goal can be, let's say, coding, and to the point that in the question asked, lots of demand for digital skills. But I think it's important when one thinks about the kind of content to think through where on the target audience's journey are there, and what are you doing to get them to that next level. And I think it's important to not only say, like, look, I'm going to have a Java HTML course, but almost saying, how am I going to almost get my target audience to walk before they run, to take them on that journey. And I think what you're seeing there is the demand for courses being ones that are able to articulate, again, that narrative or thread, realizing that everyone has a different starting point in terms of their, let's call it, digital nativeness.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and actually sort of segues into this next question quite well. So someone here is asking about the training requirements for teachers in an edtech or e-learning environment. And I mean, this is a key problem that we see quite a lot of the time with our founders trying to work in classrooms or in other sort of, in-person facilities. And the actual trainers or the teachers have no idea how to use the product. They can't the child effectively, they can't help support the child effectively, or the learner, the adult learner. Does anyone have any thoughts on how edtech innovators should be thinking about the training side of their solution, and making sure that facilitators are equipped to handle any sort of support needs that their solution requires?
To probably give some initial thoughts, but I'm sure they'll defer to the judgment and expertise of some other people on the panel. And I want to probably just lean on two experiences. One, just in my research and when I was doing my postgraduate degree, was actually around how do you implement successfully education technologies in low resource settings across Africa. So that was my master's at Oxford. But in the same vein there, the insight was around, one, the role of teachers changing in that particular situation, and therefore as an edtech founder or someone trying to purport or support edtech, you approach things differently with a teacher. But then when I also juxtapose that against our experience at St. John's, where over the last 2 years have been trying to digitize even the environment at even a high-end school, which is fairly well resourced. And I think the key principles remain the same. I think, the same way someone trusts that when they use a chalkboard, that the chalk will always write on the board when they put their chalk, put the piece of chalk to the board, they need to have that same level of confidence and trust in the technology. And I think the most enabling factor over and above the training, and the training being contextualized and everything that everyone's mentioned in terms of general training, is the importance of having and allowing for significant amount of support early on. And I've found that to be very successful, because what it does mean, teachers then feel comfortable using technologies, because you can invest in a smart board, and a teacher, you only use a 10% of that functionality because they don't have trust in the rest of the functionality. They know it exists, but they don't trust that it'll be effective for their pedagogical approach. And I think that's where I think as founders and edtech companies, it's important for us to not discount the fact that these are new inventions for someone who's been in the classroom for the last 40 years. And I think having that level of understanding and consideration, particularly when it comes to support, I think was very powerful and important for us at St. John's, where we transitioned from an instance even well ahead of the lockdown in South Africa to a point where many of our teachers were all digitally online, and also, to the point raised, effectively using technology tools that the school has invested in over a period of time.
Mm. Yeah, great point. And I think, there's often a complaint that we get with some of our founders who are trying to work with teachers in classrooms, that, where they say that teachers are sort of like closed-minded, they're not interested in new technologies, they're not wanting to roll out new innovations, they want to stick with what they know and the teaching that they've, been doing for the last 30 years or whatever it might be. But, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think, there are actually plenty of teachers who would be very willing and happy to roll out new innovative approaches to teaching if they had the support that they need. Jay, do you have any comments on how that sort of plays out in the Curo context?
The Curo context, and even some of the broader schools that we've been supporting, A couple of things. I mean, just give you an idea. In the Kuro context, we use Microsoft Teams across the board, and it's been a journey that's taken almost 3 years to actually get to a point where every teacher is actually using it and is comfortable with it. And it wasn't in that we are a group of fairly affluent schools, maybe not as affluent as St. John's, but basically, but still quite affluent schools. And it was a 3-year journey. It was quite a painful journey as well. And none of the teachers saw the need for it. They were like, well, what's the point, and so forth. But somehow we managed to get to the point where everyone was using it. And when when the lockdown hit, we were quite fortunate that way that everyone had transitioned. A couple of lessons, though, was that in every school, you're going to find 3 or 4 teachers that are early adopters. So you need to identify those. You need to find those that are going to be the champions of your solution. But you can't have those early adopters, the ones that you choose, cannot be call it the tech geeks that will try out every new thing. They have to be the ones that have a good rapport with the rest of the teachers, and are the ones that all the teachers look to as the IT guru that they would actually ask for help, but not the IT technician themselves. So you need to identify those individuals and get them on board, and where the use case and the actual benefits are very clear for that individual. So for instance, one of the solutions that we rolled out from a reading solution in our schools, it's called Reading Eggs. It's an Australian-based solution, and really good one. Very effective in improving the kids' English and reading and comprehension levels. What we found was when we first introduced it to all the teachers, none of them were interested. They believed that an hour spent with them is better than an hour spent on the kids spending an hour on a computer on the software instead. And so what we did was we found huge resistance, and this was in our digital tech-centric schools as well. And then what we found were like 2 teachers that we found who were really passionate about it and keen to try it out. They did, and what was amazing was that company, that Edutech company, they actually sent someone who was there 24, every day for a whole week at the school, help those 2 teachers really get familiar with the product. And then, and when they were really good, the other teachers noticed that, hang on, these 2 teachers seem to have a lot of free time because, and it turned out because these 2 teachers had their kids spending an hour on the computer instead. So they were able to do marking and other things during the time that was spent in front of the computer. And these teachers had more free time. And literally, it turned out the main reason for adoption was the fact that it gave the teachers more free time, not really about educational outcomes. So it was a lesson learned for us that some of the reasons for adoption won't be as clear cut. But yeah, so I think the basics would be find 2-3 people at each school that are really would be the ones who would be the early adopters. Get them really trained up well, and don't just spend an hour or 2 on a webinar and say good luck. Spend the time with them on site, and only then you'll get that traction going.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I think we are just about out of time, so maybe we can just get some closing final words from each of the panelists. Maybe some last advice for any of these Singapore companies who are looking to work in the African context, sort of your best, most valuable insights. Bambora, do you want to start us off?
So what I will say is I saw a question about somebody asking whether the best opportunities are in B2C or B2B, and I just wanted to give the feedback there that in the countries that we work in as ENESA, we find that most of the schools, first of all, are public schools, and the government has a lot of control with regards to what happens in those public schools, right? So where EdTech has flourished or has grown, it has started by targeting either private schools, right, with the products, learning management platforms or financial management platforms for schools, or targeting parents and students out of the school context, with supplementary material. And I think you could either start there, or you could fill gaps that are in places where things are growing, but they're still quite nascent, which is like in robotics and again in educational entertainment. But most of all, I think I'd just like to emphasize that the context is different and the flexibility is important when it comes to thinking about how to deliver your product and business model and how to receive payment for your product. But thank you for the opportunity. Okay.
Thanks, Ombora. Dylan, do you have any closing words for the audience?
Excuse me. Yeah, I think that a lot of what we've discussed today is sort of kept backtracking to all of the constraints for EdTech in Africa. And I think that one of the most encouraging and most important things is to not be overwhelmed by that. Obviously, those constraints exist in terms of what the technology is that's out there and you know, the realities of the situation on the ground. However, our philosophy is increasingly to not retrogressively design. What we're trying to do is build a combo of things so that we are actually always moving forward and not to be overwhelmed by the constraints and sort of held back. So it's just important, I think, to remember that we can still make really cool, great things and that there is a market for them. Thanks, guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks, Dylan. Nice, optimistic message. Melvin, any last words from your side?
Yeah, and I think definitely in the same vein as both Dylan and Ombora and what they mentioned, but I think something which is important with any market, but more so in Africa, as I think the importance of focus. I think it's very easy to think you're going to conquer the African continent, not necessarily be specific on what you actually want to achieve in that particular way. And so I definitely implore anyone looking at the space to identify local partners and, you know, find ways of collaboration, just so you make sure that, I always say, you want to be paying new school fees and making new mistakes. And so I think at that level, work with those who have already paid those school fees. But in the same vein, I think there's a unique opportunity on the continent. I'd probably say now more so than ever during my time in this space. And so definitely very optimistic.
Thanks, Melvin. Jay, your side.
Yeah, I think first of all, I mean, we're addressing edtech companies in Singapore. I think one thing for sure is that there's a Singaporean company as a whole has this great reputation across the board, at least in South Africa, that, you know, you've got excellent education and so forth. So any solution coming out of Singapore is regarded already in a very in high esteem. I think the main thing again is, if you're going for a B2C kind of solution, really try to make sure that you're doing a mobile first type solution and where you really try to limit data usage as much as possible. And then of course, really look at the local context as much as possible and reach out to those of us in the panel, etc. And I'm sure that even Enterprise Singapore could help even more in specific countries and so forth. But do not, I would say, do not hesitate to actually ask for help, I think, and get more and more local context. In terms of the market, I think there's a large market. I think there are a lot of, I think it's just the right time to actually get into the sector, into the market, and come with good EdTech solutions.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I mean, thanks to all the panelists. I think from Ingeni's side, you know, we can relate to a lot of what's being discussed here from what we've seen in the founders that we've worked with. There are, as you would have heard, there are a lot of, you know, major challenges in the educational sector across the continent that need addressing with innovative solutions. So, I mean, we welcome foreign founders from Singapore and all over the world to bring these solutions to the continent, as long as they are, you know, aware of the context and the realities on the ground, and work closely with the local communities, as has been discussed. So, Yeah, thanks everyone for your contributions. I think this has been a really interesting and the different challenges and opportunities you're facing. Hopefully our audience has as well. Thanks everyone, and thanks Enterprise Singapore for the opportunity to moderate this discussion.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Davidson and our panelists for the insightful sharing. All of you really did very well, in terms of covering a lot of grounds within the short time for this discussion. So we really appreciate that. And the discussion has been really insightful. So thanks. We've now come to the end of our webinar today. Thank you everyone for your participation, and a huge thank you once again to our panel of speakers for being so generous with your time. We definitely hope that it has been an interesting session for all of you. Should you have any further questions or like to be connected to the panel of speakers here, we'd be happy to for you to actually email my colleague Huda. You can reach out to us again, and then if you need later on. There's also the post-event survey in which you can basically give us your feedback, and we hope to have your inputs to improve on future sessions. So thank you once again, and have a good rest of the day.